Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. The School of Energy Resources Center for Energy Regulation and Policy Analysis takes a forward-looking approach to position Wyoming's energy and mineral production for long-term success. Today, we're joined by Matt Fry. He's the director of what we call SERPA, that's the Center for Energy Regulation and Policy Analysis, at the School of Energy Resources, and he'll be discussing the evolving landscape of energy regulation and policy in Wyoming and how SERPA contributes to that and his vision for the center. So, Matt, welcome. Let's begin with your background.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Talk about your education and the journey that led you to live here in Wyoming.
Well, it wasn't a straight path, but I'll make it as quick as I can. I grew up in Virginia. Always enjoyed the outdoors. My goal in life was to be a fish biologist so I could play outside, call that a job, and do those sorts of things. I went to school, undergraduate degree from Davison Elkins College in Elkins, West Virginia, in biology and chemistry with the expectation that I'd be a fish biologist. Worked in that space for quite a number of years on and off, had some transitions, did some work in the private sector on regulation, did some work for the highway department in Virginia on regulation. Anyway, eventually made my way out to Wyoming because there's no people here and there's elk, and I really wanted to live in a place where I had these opportunities. So that's kind of how I got here. Started working for the Game and Fish Department. That evolved into policy work, and then through a number of years, I ended up here. Was there a set point where energy kind of came into play? You became interested in that? Yeah, definitely so. So at the Game and Fish Department, there was this program where we worked specifically on making recommendations to minimize impacts to our resources, fish and wildlife resources, while still allowing development to occur in the state. So it gives you a really good understanding of what the development is. The option is not to say no. The option is to figure out how to do this in a balanced way. So over time, I got more engaged in things. It was back at a time during the Friedenthal administration, actually, where we were going through our initial wind boom in the state. So with wind, you require transmission lines. And we were also finishing up in kind of peak demand for the anticline, the natural gas fields and the anticline. And we needed a gas pipeline to get that to market. So that's when I started to see the real benefits to the state and the real challenges to other resources, and really enjoyed the opportunity to balance those out. So Governor Friedenthal had a way of taking employees from the state, and he'd move those into kind of resource experts for his staff. So I managed the siting and the mitigation associated with projects like the Ruby Pipeline, Gateway West, Gateway South, Trans-West Express, and that opened my eyes to this space. So with that, I kind of transitioned into the Governor Meade's staff, where I worked as a policy advisor for him, and that really opened my eyes to the state writ large, like everything that's important to the state, not just fish and wildlife resources. So from there, I realized I was having kids. This is probably more important than what I was doing before, so that's where I refocused and came into the energy policy space.
Great. And you've had some really key roles in policy. You talked a lot about the state level. You've also worked kind of at the federal level and with other states. So can you talk about your other experiences that shaped your perspective on energy regulation and policy?
Sure. Yeah. While I was with Governor Meade, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of different states. We had a multi-state working group that worked on carbon management projects and policies nationally, to be honest. And that was managed by the Great Plains Institute, and we'll get into them here in a second. But had the opportunity to work with a lot of states. Actually, that's where I met you when you were with Peabody.
Oh.
Yeah, when we were working on these things. So I chaired that for the governor, and it opened my eyes to the diversity. Like Wyoming, we are very, very focused on energy because that's our that's
bread
our
and butter.
economy,
Yeah.
right? Other states are less so, but they're all dependent on energy. And that's what's the important thing is like we need two things. We need water and we need energy.
Right.
Those are the things that we need as humans. So that's where I got into more of a national perspective. After I left the governor's office, I needed to stick around with the state for a little while. My wife was sick, so needed to do some things to take care of that. But once she got better and got through all of that, I had the opportunity to go work for GPI, and that was fantastic. That's when I really got the national perspective. We worked with 20 to 30 states on energy policy issues. And it diversified things because you're working with red states, blue states, purple states, and you have to figure out how to talk with all of them in a way that meets their demands and meets their political demands.
And what's important to all of them?
All of them?
Yeah. No, I'm saying that's you had to talk about what was important to them, 100%. Right? And I think it's interesting that there are organizations like Great Plains Institute that know how to work really with different stakeholders, including states, but also industries and nonprofits around a common theme, even though the reason folks are interested in a topic isn't the same. So,
yeah.
So what led you specifically to this role as director for the Center of Energy Regulation Policy Analysis, which from here on out, I'm going to call CERPA. Was there a pivotal moment that made you realize it was the right step, or was it the fact that I kept pestering you and wouldn't take no for an answer, or what was it exactly?
Yeah, I like to say you're a great recruiter, for sure. But yeah, I've been with GPI for about 4 years, and as you know, my kids are young, and when you work for a national group, you're on the road a lot, and love the work, love the opportunities that it provided, learned a lot, and I think we did a lot of really good things. But when you came and said, hey, do you want to come do this? I was like, this is probably a pretty ideal time to come back to Wyoming. So honestly, Wyoming's home. I've been here, I was thinking about it this weekend, 21 years ago today, I was probably packing my boxes, getting ready to move out and start work on April 1st. So
wow.
Yeah, this is home to me, and I was happy to come back and focus more specifically on Wyoming and the issues of home, but I still get the opportunity to kind of take a national perspective because I think it's important that we understand what the national issues are and the global issues, but I'm happy to be working in Wyoming.
Yeah, and it is important because Wyoming's energy sector is shaped by policies, not just here. We're a huge exporter, and we'll talk about that. So this is where the center that you lead, CERPA, really can play an important role in helping us understand both what's happening in the state and beyond. So let's talk about CERPA for a minute. So what's the center's main focus areas, and how do you see it helping shape Wyoming's energy landscape and contributing?
Yeah, so obviously been here 3 months, so you know as much as more about CERPA than I do. But
no, it's you're the lead. Let's go.
So, but yeah, I think that we have a real opportunity within CERPA. We're surrounded by experts, technical experts that provide us information. My goal has always been to form policy based on science, data, and real world information. Not everybody agrees with that, as you see in the newspaper, but I think it's pretty important if you actually want to build good policy. So my vision for CERPA would be that we actually take those data points, take that analysis, those analyses that we work through, and provide them as information to policymakers. Like, we're not advocates, we're not probably technically supposed to be advocates, but we can certainly inform, and to have all of the expertise and information available at our hands here to provide to people in leadership roles and policy roles. That's where I see us leading the way for Wyoming's policy future.
Sure. And yeah, I think that's fair. Like, we can put out information. It's up to you if you want to use it, but at least I think Wyoming will have the data and analysis it needs to make good decisions about our energy sector. So from your perspective, what would you say, and yes, you've only had this job a few months, but you have been involved with Wyoming Energy for a long time. So I feel like this is fair. So what are some of the biggest challenges or opportunities you see facing the state and its energy sector?
Sure. The biggest challenges are clearly market change. Like, we've seen it. I did some quick reviews over like the last 30 years, I think, going back to the Bush administration and the 2005 Energy Policy Act. That's where we started talking about climate, and that's when we started talking about potential transitions. And honestly, the energy markets have transitioned since, we used to burn whale oil, right?
Yeah.
Things have changed a lot.
You know, it's funny. The whale oil is actually the one big transition, but generally things have mostly been added, but we have seen big changes, right? Like coal consumption is less than half of what it was, at least Wyoming coal consumption. So.
Yeah, and we lead coal consumption. So if it's half for us, it's well above that for others. So yeah, I think that we have the opportunity, and the things that I would like to work on would be to focus on where our strengths are and see as technology evolves how we can maintain those strengths. And we'll get into exports and things of that nature in a bit, but I think that we really need to be focused on what markets want and how we can meet those market demands.
Sure. And talking about markets, Wyoming is an energy exporting state, and that is really important to our energy sector. The amount of energy we produce is way too big for us to consume internally to the state. So being able to rely on markets outside the state is really important. And so when we talk about exports, we're usually not talking about international exports. We're talking about exports to other states, although we would love to do international exports, and we will continue to work on that. But for now, we'll talk about other states. Can you talk about Wyoming's role as an exporter to other states and break down what that looks like?
Sure. So our big export is obviously coal. We're small. We have 500,000 people, and we have a lot of coal. We can't burn it all. We're finishing up an analysis that we'll be able to present to everybody at some point in the very near future, but it looks at our coal exports, and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's like 90% is export. Yeah.
92.7.
Yes. So you remember that better than me. That's critical. The real challenge is other states that we transport to are having policy changes, and they're having regulatory changes. This meets all of our exports. Like, we're a fossil fuel state, and as fossil fuel goes, it goes for all of them. So the challenge is these other states enact regulations, law, policy that reduces their emission criteria. We have to figure out how to work with that. And
right.
Like this institution's done that work, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, but we've led the way in that over the years. But I think the state has to continue our paradigm of an all-of-the-above strategy if we're going to maintain our active participation in those markets. And you brought up export internationally. I think we need to figure out how to penetrate those markets, because we provide an opportunity to those other regulated markets that we can meet and definitely increase our export potential.
There's demand. It's a question of us being able to get our energy outside beyond the borders. And really, for Wyoming, whether you're talking about coal or really gas, we're talking about the West Coast. And that's our challenge. So that's why it is important for us to work on all these technologies. And so you've already kind of been tiptoeing around it. So let's just talk about it. So Wyoming's been a leader in carbon capture, use, and storage, or otherwise known as CCUS. So first of all, talk about how that could play into continued Wyoming energy use in Wyoming, but also obviously in these, what we're calling export markets.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different ways. So first, internally, if we build out these potential technologies, whether they're retrofits or they're new facilities on the front end of our combustion technology, whatever works, right? There's a lot of different technologies to work through there. We provide ourselves the opportunity to continue to utilize resources internally. I think also we have the opportunity to develop these technologies so that states that we export to can learn and utilize the resources that we develop in the state, and we can just continue to be the research leader in that space, so folks can take the things that we learn and build them out, and then they too can utilize those CCUS technologies, so they are as well allowed to utilize our resources and maintain their regulatory requirements.
Yeah. And for most people listening to this podcast are probably pretty familiar with what we mean by CCUS, but you use some terms in there, so we'll break it down. Like retrofitting just is to add carbon capture to an existing facility. In this case, we're mostly talking about power plants, not exclusively. Certainly you could add carbon capture to a gas processing facility or something like that. But when you're thinking about power plants, what we're talking about is really just carbon capture is just the act of separating carbon dioxide from other gases, so it's pure. And then there are new technologies that aren't quite on the market yet that would allow you to use either natural gas or coal to generate electricity, where you don't have to do carbon capture. It's inherent to the process. And so the power plant, essentially what it generates is a pure stream of CO2. So talk about, we're being proactive to help meet regulations or targets in other states. We're also addressing at some point if there were to be a federal regulation requiring CCUS or requiring plants to close without CCUS added to it, that we're trying to be proactive in developing this technology. So that's one reason we're working on it. But as industry folks look at how to deploy the technology, there's policies like the 45Q tax credit, and those play a role in CCUS development. So you can talk about how that incentive works and why it matters, and why, if you think it's important, why is it important to have incentives as a technology is first being deployed?
Sure. So the 45Q tax policy was enacted in 2008 under the Bush administration. The money pretty quickly ran out. It took, nearly 10 years to get it reenacted or refunded, replenished in 2018 under the Future Act. So it was replenished. What that did was made their money available again, and it increased those tax credit opportunities for folks. And I'll talk about what those are in a second. And then again in 2022 in the infrastructure law, the tax credits were once again increased. So what it provides is a $60 per ton tax credit for folks who are using CO2 that can be used for things like enhanced oil recovery or for making products like methanol, things of that nature. You can do a lot of things with CO2. It's just very technical and very expensive.
And very energy intensive. The big use is enhanced oil recovery.
That's the key use, I think. And that's
today.
And that's why that lower threshold, $60 a ton, was enacted, and it maintains its value today. The other value, $85 a ton, that's for straight storage. So what you do, that's just what it is. It's storage specific. You store CO2 in the pore space of geology deep in the subsurface, 5 to 10,000 feet. I'm not going to get any deeper than that.
No, we have a lot of podcasts on that.
Yeah,
the details.
There's a lot of smart rock people in the room, in the building, so I'm not one of them. And then what it also did was add an additional 40 tax credit for direct air capture that was not available in the previous iteration. So the meat of it is that the 45Q tax credit is available if you permanently store CO2. So to capture it, you don't get anything. You have to store it permanently. The challenge is the person that captures it is the one who's allowed to receive the 45Q tax credit. So there are some downstream and upstream challenges and some contract issues that make it pretty challenging to work through. In the new iteration of the tax policy, it allowed for a direct pay. That's important because many companies don't have any tax liability, so it did them no good to utilize the technology. So what I think 45Q does is what every tax policy has done in the history of U.S. energy evolution. It provides an incentive to do things that are new and different.
Right.
So there is no market at this point. I mean, there's clearly an EOR market, which is why the tax credit's lower. There is no storage market. So the goal was to incentivize storage of CO2 so that on the back end, we actually have a market. It follows things like wind and everything else that we've done in the past.
Yeah. So it's a good point. This tax credit it's not really a new model. It's something that's been deployed for years for other technologies, and it's a way to incentivize behavior to move towards a specific technology. And it's a carrot instead of a stick, right? So it's an incentive. It's not a regulation or a law. Do you think tax credits are the most efficient way to incentivize energy technologies?
They're the most politically palatable way to incentivize. Like, there's no question that if we were to have a credit or a tax on CO2 emissions, we'd have a market tomorrow, but it's not a political reality in the U.S.
Sure.
Other governments have done it, and good for them if that's what works in your country, but it doesn't work in ours.
It doesn't work here. I think it's funny because, I'm an engineer by training, and I just remember as I was kind of going through my career, learning about tax credits and thinking this is how we incentivize energy is through tax credits. But it's the model that we've chosen to use in this country, and it has worked for other energy technologies. So, and Wyoming, as you said, has long been a leader in carbon capture use and storage projects. There's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I just think Wyoming in general is a good place to demonstrate new technologies. You can see we have the largest onshore wind farm being built. We have the TerraPower advanced reactor. We have several carbon storage projects moving forward. We have rare element resources and other entities looking at rare earth elements. The list just keeps going. But for CCUS, are there any specific projects that you see as like models or particularly valuable for learnings?
Sure. And I would just back up and say the reason that we were so interested in CCUS from the get-go and pushing statute in the state forward is under the Obama administration, we were pretty fearful of what was going to happen with that initial clean power plan. So that's when we got really proactive as a state. I won't say scared because it's probably not the right thing to say, but we definitely got proactive. So following that, we had the ITC come on board under the Meade administration. I mean, you all manage, the SER manages that at this point.
Yeah.
Lots of good research being done there on technologies that hopefully go to market scale and we can deploy them here and elsewhere in the country. And then along those same lines, one of the projects that I managed for the state when I was with the state previously was a large intra-state pipeline corridor initiative, and happy to get into that if you want.
Yeah, so just integrated test center, it's a technology neutral test center at Basin Electric's Dry Fork Power Plant, and we have all kinds of technologies being tested there, not only technologies developed by SER, but really from developers all over the world. And the whole goal of having that test center stood up is to try to find new ways to do the capture, which again is just that separation of CO2, and find new ways to do it that's going to be less expensive. Because I think we see a lot of CCUS projects moving forward, but they're not moving forward to commercialization. If we can bring down the costs, even if there is no regulation driver for direct storage in the near term, there are markets for the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, and those projects could move forward. But we have to bring down the costs. We're not quite, even with the tax credit, we're not quite making the price threshold that's needed. So, but Wyoming's done so much work, and the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative, or WPCI, you've already mentioned, is a really important part of that. And it's just another aspect of how Wyoming's been proactive in getting ahead of the game, thinking down the road, like maybe we don't need these pipelines today, but we will need them in the future. And it takes a lot of work. So talk about what the WPCI is and like how that process was carried out.
Sure. It's once again one of those things that was proactive in the understanding that a clean power plan was coming, and we still wanted to develop our oil resources. This started at the end of the Friedenthal administration, where we did the original analysis. EORI did the original, Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute did the original analysis on where those potential oil fields, EOR fields, were available. We knew where our emission sources, our CO2 emission sources were, and we just needed to figure out a reasonable and buildable pathway to get from our emission sources to our enhanced oil recovery fields. We have challenges in the state. We're around 50% federally surface owned. So every time you do something on federal surface, you have to receive a federal authorization, and that's a big challenge. And it was even bigger when we were looking at the entire state. So it's a roughly 2,000-mile corridor system across the state, 1,400 miles of it on federal lands. And the intent was that we would receive a federal authorization that officially designated those corridors. And then on the back end, folks would likely receive a lesser requirement for authorizations because we'd done upfront analysis on the corridor system. So the legislature was key here, as you might imagine, to do an analysis on 2,000 miles of corridor. It's not cheap. So they were insightful, as they'd been for like 10 plus years on carbon management, I'll say writ large technologies. They provided a $2 million appropriation that funded the project. I started the work early in the Meade administration. It ran roughly 10 years. 8 years of that was to get the Bureau of Land Management to agree to do the project. And then the 2-year analysis to get the authorization done. It was ironic that it ran through the Obama administration and the first Trump administration, and Secretary Bernhardt signed the decision record on WPCI on his last day in the office on a Friday at the end of the administration. So I was a little nervous because you never know what's going to happen in that transition. So it was forward thinking, and it provides us the opportunity to get from a source to sink in a buildable manner, not in a modeled manner, but in an actual analyzed buildable manner.
Yeah. So let me make sure I understand. So the idea was we have oil fields that need CO2. We have an expectation that at that time there would be some sort of regulation on the power sector that would require an emission and reduction in CO2. And so you did all this work to connect all our really power plants and other emitting sources to our oil fields that need oil. And so if a commercial entity wants to build that, a lot of that work with the federal government, getting federal approvals has been done, or a lot of information's been supplied. So their bar for their permitting would be, their threshold would be lower because a lot of work's been done?
Yeah, we had to do an environmental impact statement for the entire state. So I think it was 7 BLM field offices. And what that did was change the resource management plans that officially designated these corridors in the RMP. So that analysis is kind of like an overarching umbrella analysis. And if you want to build within that corridor, you come in at a subset. Theoretically, you should be able to do that with an environmental analysis, an EA, which is a lesser amount of analysis, lesser cost, lesser time. And that was the goal, was to make it easier to build these pipelines, because as you mentioned, the real challenge here is, well, there's 2 challenges. Capture is really expensive, and building pipelines is really expensive. When I started WPCI, we were talking $1 million a mile for a pipeline, $1 million a mile for a pipeline. The last analysis that I saw when I was working on the NPC's hydrogen report, they did a pipeline, and now it's more like $3 million a mile at this point. So they're expensive to build, and you just want to make sure that you can do the most you can to incentivize folks to do it.
Right. And make, as companies look at where they're going to invest their dollars, make it easier to invest here in Wyoming.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
Like we are, that is the goal. If you want to build something, come here and do it.
Yeah. Especially stuff that we're good at, like energy and moving CO2 around. We're one of the few states that already has a CO2 pipeline, has enhanced oil recovery operating today. So now that the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative work has been done and the EIS has been approved, is there anything else Wyoming should do from your perspective, to position itself to capitalize on that, and particularly around enhanced oil recovery?
Yeah, I think we know, we have a firm understanding of what fields we can, maybe should target. I've talked about this for 15 years now. The Bighorn Basin is a tremendous opportunity. That was kind of the motivator. Governor Friedenthal was from the Bighorn Basin, and he wanted to see economic development expand there to what it used to be with those oil fields. So I do really think that we need to look at what the most techno-economic, advantageous, a lot of words, but what the best capture technology is versus whether we build a pipeline. So that's some of the work that I would like to do in the future. Yeah.
And going back to one of our early questions about why did you want to come work here? I'm pretty sure in that recruiting process, you were like, can I work on the Bighorn Basin? You did. Yes. And I said yes. And you were like, okay, I think that's what sealed the deal, personally. I'm either stubborn or not a quitter, but I've wanted to get CO2 there for 15 plus years now. We're going to figure out how to make that happen. Yeah. So, and that's a great segue. So when you think about energy regulation and policy analysis and federal lands and energy technology, there's essentially limitless topics that SERPA could research. Can you talk about your vision and priorities and how you'll prioritize what you all take on? I can try anyway. I think we constantly have to look at our traditional resources and how we maintain those, because they pay the bills. They've always paid the bills, and we would like them to continue to pay the bills. But there's a lot of new technology and a lot of new opportunities out there. We're getting ready to start work on a paper that looks at potential deployment scenarios for hydrogen in the state and what policies or regulations are available or needed and what the tax structure is, just to kind of help inform that resource and that technology.
I'd like to look at geothermal as well. Like we've been talking about geothermal nationally. The new president has mentioned geothermal. Our opportunities aren't as great as some other places, but we have something. So we should at least quantify what we have so we know what we could do. I want to look at capture technologies. I want to do some more educational things. I would really like to do an educational thing on what 45Q is, because we hear people talk about it a lot and they're not necessarily always correct. So it's that kind of educational stuff that comes out that can help inform, whoever wants to read it.
Yeah. And I also want to give a quick plug to one of the new things that one of your folks has developed since you've been here, and it's called the Crew Report. And so can you talk just real quickly, what is that and where do folks find it?
Sure. The Crew Report is awesome. You should all check it out. Dawson does a really good job on this. It talks about our monthly production numbers as well as our monthly export dollar numbers, things of that nature. Just provides a great overview of what we produce and sell in Wyoming. He also talks about where it goes to a certain extent. So it really provides good information for folks who want to know what our energy resources are and who's using them.
Yep. And that's Dawson Klusner. And yeah, it was kind of his brainchild. And I think other states have something like that where you can go to one source and kind of get a snapshot of what's happening in the energy sector in the state. And so now Wyoming has one too. And that's part of less maybe researchy, but more in our service role as an entity, a land-grant institution and serving the state. So is there anything else you want to add about SERPA or anything coming up that you want to share?
I think that's probably it that's finalized. I do need to get some more things actually finalized, but yeah, we're working through some reports and some analyses that were underway when I got here. Esther just finished up a really cool natural gas thing to help inform that export market potential. But yeah, I think we're just evolving in my 3 months, and we'll have some more firm things to talk about in the future. Yeah,
your predecessor, Kara Fornstrom, left you quite the pipeline of papers, so it's been good. For our last question, we just switched gears a little. It's our only question that's not about either energy or leadership. So, Matt, tell us, what's your favorite place to visit in Wyoming?
I love the mountains, which is one of the reasons that I came out here, obviously. But my favorite place to visit in Wyoming is called the Upper Hoback. It is a dead-end gravel road in western Wyoming that goes into the upper end of the Hoback River drainage. There's nothing that special about it. Like, it doesn't look like the Tetons. It doesn't look like any of the spectacular scenes that you see in Wyoming postcards. But I spent a lot of time there when I was younger, just wandering around there, hunted, hiked, things of that nature. So it's not heavily used because it doesn't have that picturesque postcard scene, but that is my favorite place in Wyoming to go. It's just harder to go there now because it's like a 6-hour drive.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Okay. Well, Matt, thank you so much for being here finally after being recruited for a very long time by me. And thanks for all you've done for Wyoming over the years. And thanks for doing the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.